All this gear kind of seems a little silly, but it wouldn't have seemed silly 250 million years ago. You know why? Well, we are on the edge of a Permian reef. If you can imagine, this was once a vast tropical sea. That's the main reef behind me, and right where we're standing, this was the forereef. You can see sponges, you can see algae, you can even see some mollusk. And yes, what we're talking about is climate change. Now, this is vastly different because we're at the Guadalupe Mountains National Park. But in order to talk about climate change, we have to take a look at our past in order to understand what could be happening in our future. I hate politics, but I love national parks.
What we see behind us is kind of a combination of the reef and some of the debris that was on the forefront of it and on the back side of it.
So check this out, guys. We've got a very well preserved clam right there. And the rest of this has sponges on it. Eventually, a 400-mile stretch of reef formed. The sea then dried up, and a mass extinction killed 90% of all living things. The reef was buried beneath salt and sediment. Millions of years later, the ancient marine reef became something new.
So this park was established for its scenery and it's also its geological resources. So that's what most of our visitors come here for.
This is El Capitan, what you might call the crown jewel of Guadalupe Mountains National Park. This is also a part of the Permian Reef that we've been telling you about. It's very visually stunning, and it's right on the edge of the Trans-Pecos region, a beautiful mountain and monument to history. Well, you might be asking yourself, what does me walking towards this mountain have to do with your vote? Well, more than you might think. The changes here at the park may have occurred over millions of years, but climate experts say there's something different at play now. It is National Park. He's actually seen where we're standing at right now flood twice. Now, this is a creek bed, so that's not completely uncommon, but as it increases in frequency and intensity, that could lead to a bigger issue.
Climate change has been the #1 most politicized issue in the entire United States for years now. And it's not because people truly disagree over the number that the thermometer gives us. It's because we disagree over what to do about it.
That's Katherine Hayhoe, a rock star in the climate world and so-called climate evangelical. She says it's critical to take action now.
The percentage of people who actually categorically deny that this is an issue is very small. It's only 10% across the whole U.S. But that 10%, the tail of the dog, so to speak, is wagging the whole dog. And what we need to do is we need change. And change in a democratic society begins with decision makers. Decision makers at the level of an individual company or a city or a state or the country. So the most important thing that any of us can do as individuals is to use our voice to advocate for change.
Attitudes about climate change are changing, and more people are doing just that.
What do we want? We're
A study this year by Pew Research Center shows more Americans are now worried about climate change. About 60% of Americans think climate change is a major threat to the United States. But, and it's a big but, there's a staggering political divide. If we break those numbers down by party, nearly 90% of Democrats and Democrat-leaning independents consider it a major threat, while only about a third of Republican and Republican-leaning independents feel that way. A sociologist specializing in climate and politics says age can close some of that gap.
There are ways in which the polarization on climate change and other issues can ease, can change, and that largely lies in younger generations. Hey, ho, ho! Do something, de Blasio! I think, young people politically are more idealistic. They are less cynical about how deals get made and how policies get made and the impact that individuals could have on the world. A lot of young people who are self-identified Republicans, self-identified conservatives, agree with a lot of the current national leaders on the right with regards to taxation, foreign policy, and so on, where they vehemently disagree with, say, like the current presidential administration or other Republican leaders in the Senate and the House, is the things like the seriousness of climate change.
More Americans than ever are certainly concerned, but the policy gap between candidates, it's never really been wider.
It often seems that every election is the do or die election, but this one seems particularly important because in the United States, people don't have a choice between two parties who both say, yes, this is a problem, and here we have competing visions about how to fix it. Instead, there's a choice between two parties, one of whom says it is a problem and here's how we want to fix it, and the other party who says not only that it isn't a problem, but they're actually actively working against it by repealing long-standing environmental legislation that protects people's air and water and health, by putting in place actions that will eventually increase carbon emissions rather than decreasing them, by moving in the wrong direction.
Joe Biden's climate plan is more aggressive than Hillary Clinton's 4 years ago and far more ambitious than anything implemented under President Obama, although it still falls short of the proposed Green New Deal.
We can and we will deal with climate change. It's not only a crisis, it's an enormous opportunity. An opportunity for America to lead the world in clean energy and create millions of new, good-paying jobs in the process. And we can pay for these investments by ending loopholes, unnecessary loopholes, and the president's $1.3 trillion tax giveaway to the wealthiest 1% and the biggest, most profitable corporations, some of which do not pay any tax at all.
The Biden campaign released a nearly $2 trillion plan for clean energy. That's trillion with a T, cutting the American carbon footprint by 50% by 2035 and committing to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2035. And as for the Trump campaign,
one of the things I got you out of is this thing sounds so good, but it's so bad. It's a ripoff of our country, the so-called Paris Climate Accord. It's a disaster, a death sentence. It's a death sentence for your energy jobs. I took it out. I withdrew from that calamity. Biden pledged to reinstate it. It's going to cost you billions and billions of dollars.
President Trump released a report from the Department of Energy a month before the election that says the oil and gas industry is a provider of economic security without mentioning the impacts of oil and gas at all. In fact, the entire report, it only mentions the word climate once. Oil and gas production, a major priority of his presidency. An executive order issued shortly after President Trump took office required that for every new environmental regulation, 2 had to be eliminated. In the last few years, nearly 70 rules and regulations have been rolled back, with another 30 still in progress. That's according to a New York Times report. And if reelected, the Paris climate deal is at stake. In 2019, President Trump issued a formal notice that the United States is pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord, a global effort to reduce fossil emissions. but the U.S. can't actually withdraw until November 4th. That's one day after Election Day. Since I'm standing in a national park, I'd be remiss not to talk about the president's position on opening up national parks and the area around national parks for oil and gas drilling. He is, in fact, for it. The National Park Conservation Association says 12 parks have already had oil and gas operations implemented inside their borders, and at least 30 more may be to follow, putting ecosystems and wildlife habitats at risk of pollution. Including this one. Biden has said that he's opposed to the idea. And remember, according to science, oil and gas use, they are the main cause of climate change.
Climate change is loading the dice against us, and it is affecting us right here, right now, in the places where we live, in ways that matter to us today.
We made it to the sand dunes of Guadalupe Mountains National Park, which Dr. Medrano said was his favorite part of the entire park. A very stark contrast from the Permian Reef that we were showing you before. But all of this really shows you the difference in just the climates right here in one single park.
If they continue the way they are, I would suspect that we will start to see more changes, especially with like timing of flowering plants and resource availability. I think that'll have an impact going forward.
As changes in our environments impact our daily lives and our parks, it's important to understand how your vote can shape the future. I'm Tabitha Lipkin, and I hate politics, but I love all of this. Yeah, and we didn't want to talk about the threats to our national parks without offering more opportunity to protect them. Stephanie Kodish is the Senior Director and Counsel for the National Parks Conservatory Association's Clean Air Program, and she says people can definitely still get involved to protect our parks.
In what ways is climate change impacting national parks?
In the 100-year history of our national parks, climate change is the greatest threat facing them. The effects of climate change are pervasive across our national parks. You know, our parks and adjacent communities are seeing global warming affect them at double the rates as the rest of the country. And part of the reason is because our parks are in special areas. You know, these are high mountains and arid deserts in the Arctic. And they are having catastrophic changes. Even right now, we're experiencing double wildfire over natural areas across the West, and that includes places like Yosemite. We're seeing raised sea levels at the Statue of Liberty National Monument in New York, and melting glaciers at places like Glacier National Park. So the effects are real, they're happening now, and they are pervasive.
How does policy impact that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think to begin with, our policies must be based on science and fact, and they must prioritize public health and welfare, not fossil fuel interests and profits. And that's exactly what we have seen. Policies that instead of placing the interests of the public at the center simply do not. And so there are a variety of existing laws that have to be upheld, and they need to be made stronger. We need to require sharp reductions in greenhouse gas pollution, and that's from cars and power plants and oil and gas industry sources. And we also need to have strong and new requirements from cities, from states, and from the federal government that prioritize transitioning to clean energy, making energy more efficient, and also place the needs of communities and of fossil fuel workers as paramount interests.
What can people do to get involved?
Yeah, that's a great question. People can call members of Congress and they can express the want to have climate policy be a priority. People can write comments when there are state or federal opportunities on air and climate policy. People can also write op-eds or post to their social to tell stories and express their value of having a clean and healthy environment. And people can also make basic changes in their day-to-day life, whether that's taking public transportation or walking or biking instead of driving. And all of those day-to-day changes are important because they lead to culture change. They lead to our culture approaching the way that we use energy resources differently.
Thank you so much for your time, Stephanie.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
And if you want to help protect our national parks, here's a couple of tips. You can call your legislators and push them to take action about climate policy. You can get involved commenting on state and federal policy. The NCPA also has guidance on their website on where to start and to look at ways of reducing your emissions. You cannot drive, and instead you can walk, bike, or take public transit instead.